Welcome to part 2 of the heart chapter. I'm going to be recording. You should be looking at your notes at the same time as you're looking at these PowerPoint presentations. So here on this slide, getting my pointer ready, you have 5 things to think about with the cardiac conduction system. You have cardiac conduction system up here. Please don't confuse this with coronary circulation. There's a lot of C words there. This is the cardiac conduction system. These are the structures that help relay the electrical signal around the heart and cause the heart to beat. There are 5 things in that cardiac conduction system. They're numbered 1 through 5 over here. The SA node, or the sinoatrial node, is the first one. It's on the superior aspect of the right atrium. These are the pacemaker cells that constantly generate a heartbeat every few seconds, every day of your life. From the SA node, the electrical signal passes to the atrioventricular node. The atrioventricular node is in the base of the atrium. There is a slight pause here, and that's good. You want that pause so the atria contract first, followed by the ventricles. You don't want all 4 chambers contracting at the same time. You want the atria to contract by this first signal here from the SA node. You want it to pause at the base of the atria for a brief second, a tenth of a second, and then the signal will continue. The signal continues down this interventricular septum. When it's joined here in the interatrial area, it is called the AV bundle right here, number 3. The AV bundle is right here. It splits midway into 2 bundle branches. They're conveniently called the right bundle branch here and the left bundle branch here. It continues down through the walls of the ventricles on either side, curving around this way, and joins up with the subendocardial network. These are small branching points that reach every square millimeter of the heart muscle, or the myocardium, and it's designed this way so that it causes the heart to contract all at once. The signal comes down and kind of swooshes around both ventricles at the same time. I can't do that, I don't have 2 laser pointers, but it causes the ventricles to contract at once. So what's happening with this cardiac conduction system is that you have the atria contracting first and then the ventricles contracting second together. Moving on to the next slide, this is the autonomic innervation of the heart. It's important to know that there are the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system. Both innervate the heart and both control the heart contractions. So the vagus nerve is the branch of the parasympathetic heart. That's this purple neuron that travels from the medulla oblongata in the brain. That's part of your brain stem. It travels through the soft tissue of the body down to the heart, and it has branches that innervate the SA node and the AV node. So when you are at rest, the vagus nerve is causing your heart to beat at the slow resting heart rate that you have, and it's regulating both the SA node and the AV node. That's good. When you're at rest, you want your heart to beat at a consistent rate that is slower than your active rate. The sympathetic nervous system starts here in the medulla oblongata. There is a cardioacceleratory center that helps to increase your heart rate and your contractility when you start exercising or when you need to run from danger. That's your sympathetic nervous system response, otherwise known as your fight or flight response. So that signal from the cardioacceleratory center travels through the spinal cord into the thoracic spinal cord, and then it passes through a series of neurons through this sympathetic trunk ganglion down, and you can follow this green neuron. It goes to the SA node, the AV node, and the left ventricle. You might wonder why the sympathetic nervous system also has nerves going to the left ventricle. Remember, this is the pump, the main pump of the body. The left ventricle pumps blood to the entire systemic circulation from head to toe. This has the biggest myocardium. It needs to contract the hardest. It has the hardest work to do. It's the biggest chamber, strongest chamber of the heart. So this sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight response, starts in the medulla oblongata, travels through the spinal cord, through a series of nerves. It innervates the SA node, the AV node, and the left ventricle. It increases your heart rate, and it increases the contractility, or the force of contraction. Think of that as making a really, really strong fist instead of a really weak, wimpy fist. Okay? You want your heart to beat stronger and faster during this sympathetic response. Next slide. This is talking about the action potential of cardiac muscle cells. There is a period during the cardiac cycle. So this whole slide is for, this whole graph is for the, it is for one heartbeat. And you do have depolarization that happens during part 1, where from the resting membrane potential of -60 or -80 millivolts, you depolarize. There's an influx of sodium into the heart muscle cells. This causes a depolarization, and then you have an action potential that happens. There is a plateau where you can't have any more heart contraction happening. That's what this absolute refractory period is about. The action potential happens, and then it drops through repolarization, where the calcium channels open, and the potassium and calcium and sodium all go back to where they belong, and then you go back to your resting membrane potential here. So the heart contracts when you have the depolarization. It contracts, and then it relaxes during repolarization and continues. All of that electrical signal that we saw on the one of the previous slides, starting with the SA node, AV node, bundle branch, right and left bundle branches, and subendocardial network, all of that is read out on an EKG or an ECG. Sometimes it's called EKG if the cardio here has a K instead of a C. One is the English version, one is the British spelling. Either one is correct. Whenever you're working somewhere, just use whichever term everybody else is using. It all means the same thing. So with the EKG tracing, you put electrodes on a person, and it's measuring the electrical signal as it passes through the body. We don't have time to go into all of the different 12 leads and how the signals all read out. This is a lead 2 that typically shows you very clearly the different phases of the cardiac cycle. So when the atria depolarize, when the SA node is sending the electrical signal to the AV node and to the left atrium, that's atrial depolarization. And what's happening there is you've got a small upward inflection on the graph. So a P wave is the first wave. They started naming this rather arbitrarily. You have to remember there is this small P wave, a QRS complex here, and then after a small rest, a T wave. And you need to know what those different components are. The P wave is for atrial depolarization. The atria are going to contract here. When the atria contract, they are pumping blood down into the ventricles. After a brief pause, then you have a QRS complex. The QRS complex is when the signal is passing through this interventricular septum to the ventricles. The electrical signal passes through the ventricles during this QRS complex. The QRS complex starts with a small downward deflection, a large upward deflection, and then a large downward deflection. So you get used to seeing this small down, big up, big down. And that, during that ventricular depolarization, that's the electrical signal passing through the ventricles, and the ventricles are going to contract immediately after this QRS complex. You have a short pause, and then a T wave is where the ventricles repolarize, and all of the calcium and sodium and potassium goes back to where it belongs, ready for the next heartbeat. So this one series of P, QRS, and T waves on this graph represent what goes on during one heartbeat. With heartbeats, you really want a regular heartbeat with waves that are the same size, that always happen with each heartbeat, and where the intervals is shown down here, all of these different intervals and segments, they are consistent. We don't have time in this class to go over what all those different intervals mean if they are abnormal in length, but it is important to know that regularity in the heartbeat, as far as how big these waves are up and down on the graph, how long the intervals are when you're going right to left on the graph, all of those things need to be regular on a normal EKG. You need to this picture. This sequence of pictures is showing what I explained, so I encourage you to follow this picture and try to make sure you know what is happening during the P wave. The atria are depolarizing. You have repolarization of the P wave at some point that's masked in this QRS complex. When the QRS complex happens, you also have ventricular depolarization. That signal is being sent around the ventricles. Here in this picture, ventricular depolarization, which is yellow, is complete, so the ventricles are going to contract during this time of the ECG, and then you have ventricular repolarization that has to happen during the T wave so that the heart can go back to its resting membrane potential of -60 to -80 millivolts and get ready to contract again. All of this is happening in less than a second. You have the events of the cardiac cycle shown here in this picture, and I want to encourage you to look at your notes and find the information where it talks about the phases of the cardiac cycle. This is on about the 4th or 5th page of the notes in the middle of the phase, in the middle of the picture, and it describes the cardiac cycle as being one heartbeat, and the phases of the cardiac cycle are the ventricular filling, ventricular systole, and ventricular diastole. If you need to pause, you can right-click on your slide and do pause recording, and that will pause things for you. Alright, so this is a normal ECG readout up here at the top. You can see that this is a normal readout, and if this is not clear to you, you should go back to the picture of the heart with the 5 parts of the cardiac conduction system and the EKG or ECG pictures to make sure that you understand what's going on with this ECG tracing. The heart sounds, you have 2 heart sounds. There's a LUP and a DUP. The first one is the LUP here, second was the DUP here. This is an audio readout that is put onto this graph to represent where valves are closing. During this first heart sound, it's immediately after the QRS complex, so this is when the ventricles are contracting right here during this phase, and during that phase the AV valves and the pulmonary semilunar valves are open for a split second, and then the AV valves close. That's good. You want the AV valves close at this point when the ventricles contract so that blood does not flow back into the atria. You want the blood to flow out through the pulmonary semilunar valve to the lungs and through the aortic valve to the systemic circulation. And that's exactly what's happening. The aortic and pulmonary valves are open at this point. You can see that the ventricles are pumping, the AV valves are closed, preventing backflow into the right atria here, the left atrium here, and then the ventricles are pumping through the pulmonary trunk and through the aorta. During the second heart sound, what's happening here is this is where blood is hitting the closed semilunar valves. This first heart sound, I forgot to mention, the blood was hitting the closed AV valves right in here. During the second heart sound, after ventricular repolarization, which happens right after this T wave, the blood comes back and is blocked by the semilunar valves right here. So the blood in the aorta does flow back and hit that valve a little bit. The blood in the pulmonary trunk is not being pumped anymore, so it does come back and hit the pulmonary valve right here. And so this second heart sound, the DUP sound, is where the blood is hitting these semilunar valves. Okay. When you look at the rest of this graph, you have pressure here on the graph, on the y-axis of the graph, and you also have ventricular volume to think about. Let's look at the volume part of this first and see how it's coordinated with the ECG. So the volume of the heart increases as the heart fills. Just think about that. When the heart pumps, the volume goes down, and then the heart starts to fill again. So here you've got the heart filling, the ventricles pump blood out of the heart, and then the ventricles start to fill again. The difference between this end diastolic volume and the end systolic volume is the stroke volume. End diastolic volume is at the end of diastole. The end of diastole is the end of the relaxation phase of the atria. Stroke volume is the difference. An average stroke volume is about 70 mils. The end systolic volume, systole refers to the pumping of the ventricles. Systole, end systolic volume means that the ventricles have pumped and emptied the heart. Please note that the heart is not completely empty of blood. There is still usually 50 mils of blood in each chamber of the heart. Each ventricle of the heart is a more specific way of saying that. When the ventricle fills, it has 120 mils of blood, as you can see up here. So the stroke volume is 120 mils minus 50 mils, which is 70 mils for a stroke volume. So the average stroke volume in a resting adult is about 70 mils. This is going to vary with the person's size, with whether they're exercising, all sorts of factors, whether their heart is in good shape or whether their heart is not in very good shapes, but 70 mils is a good average stroke volume to have in your memory for your next test. If you think about the pressures in the heart, you have 3 tracings on this pressure graph, and the pressure goes from 0 to 120. Think about the average blood pressure. Can you tell me what the average blood pressure is? It's about 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury, and that's what you're seeing here on this chart. So the average blood pressure that's measured in your arm, in your brachial artery, is similar to what is happening in the aorta. You can't put a blood pressure cuff around somebody's aorta, but it's easy to put it around somebody's arm. And the size of the vessel and the pressure in the vessel is very similar to the aorta. If you think about it, they are pretty close together in the structure of the body. So, as the heart is filling, the pressure is going down a little bit towards that 80 millimeters of mercury. When the blood pressure rises, the ventricles are contracting. And so the ventricles are contracting, they're emptying. At this point, the ventricles are empty. You know that from down here on this graph. The ventricular volume is at its low point. So the semilunar valves are closing here, and you have a little bit of a jump in the pressure. This is the blood flowing back onto those semilunar valves, and that creates this deflection, which is called the dicrotic notch. The pressure jumps up a little bit, and then it continues to go down in the aorta or the brachial artery until it reaches its low point, which on average is about 70 or 80 millimeters of mercury. If you look at the blue line here, the blue line is the pressure in the left ventricle. You have it labeled over here. So when the atria are filling, the blue line is generally low. Don't worry about this little upward inflection here, but the blue line, the ventricle, the pressure is low until the ventricles start to pump. When the ventricles are pumping down here, the pressure goes way up to that peak of 120 millimeters of mercury. You can see that over here. As the ventricles then relax, the pressure goes down to a very low point. Don't worry about how the pressure changes at this end. Just know that the pressure is low in the ventricles as it's filling. It gets very high. It reaches its peak pressure when the ventricles are completely full and contracting, and then it goes back down to a low point. So for the ventricle, you were looking at the blue line. As you go on, remember when you're doing this, if you need to pause, right-click anywhere on the screen and do pause. The third tracing we need to look at is for atrial systole. For atrial systole, or for the left atrium, sorry. With the left atrium, the pressure is generally low until the atria contract a little bit, and then it does remain low. So for the purposes of study, just remember that the atrial pressure is low, and it's the same as the ventricular pressure during the filling phases of the heart. Please pay attention to when the valves are opening and closing and coordinate that with the rest of the graph. You also have these pictures at the bottom to show you when the ventricles are filling, when the atria are filling the ventricles here. The atria are almost empty, the ventricles are almost full. Here the ventricles are full and they start to contract. Here the ventricles are emptying, and then you have the ventricular filling that happens over here. So the three phases of the heart cardiac cycle, which you have listed in your notes, correspond with these phases here at the bottom. You have the ventricular filling phase, which is mid to late diastole or relaxation. You have the ventricular systole phase, where you have the ventricles contracting, systole is contracting, and that corresponds with the highest pressure in the heart, the systolic blood pressure here. And then the third phase of the heart is diastole, where all of the chambers of the heart are relaxing and filling. The atria fill first, and then the ventricles. That's why the atria are more full here, and then the ventricles complete their filling over here in phase 1. Moving on to the next slide. This is more detail up close if you need that slide. Here is more detail here if you need bigger pictures to look at. We need to talk about the heart sounds. Each heart valve can be heard more clearly if you position your stethoscope in one of these 4 positions. This is something you will learn clinically. Right now, I just want you to know that the valves are placed in different areas of the heart, in different positions. When you listen to heart sounds, you want to try to listen between ribs. If you listen over bone, the sound will be muffled. And you can hear the aortic valve if you go to the right and superior from the heart. You can hear the pulmonary valve if you go to the left and superior of the heart. You will hear this valve more than the other 3 valves. You still can hear the other 3 valves in the background, but if you want to try to listen to this valve, this is the direction that you need to go. The mitral valve you can hear better if you migrate move the stethoscope to the lower left, and the tricuspid valve you can hear better if you move to the lower right. Clinically, you'll learn which ribs you need to be near. It's important for right now for me to just remember that you don't want to be over bone, you want to be between ribs. There are factors involved in determining cardiac output. They are detailed on this picture. This is a great picture that summarizes a lot of the concepts that we have been talking about so far. The cardiac output is the amount of blood that your heart pumps in one heartbeat. And for the average person, it's about 5 liters. It's a little higher in men. It's 5 to 6 liters in men. Actually, I said that wrong. The cardiac output is the output in 1 minute, not one heartbeat. It's 1 minute. So the men average 5 to 6 liters a minute. Women average 4 to 5 liters of cardiac output per minute. And you get the cardiac output by multiplying the stroke volume. Remember, we said an average stroke volume is 70 mils times an average heart rate of 70 or 80 beats per minute. So cardiac output will increase based on the factors in this chart. So if you increase the heart rate or you increase the stroke volume, you're going to increase the cardiac output. That's a direct relationship if you think back to some of the math classes you might have had. So if you increase the amount of volume that is pumped with each heartbeat, or if you increase the heart rate, you are going to increase the cardiac output. When you exercise, when you increase your activity in any way, either intentional exercise, running after your kids, running to your car, any kind of activity that increases your cardiac output, you're increasing the contractility of the heart, how much the heart pumps per beat, and you're increasing the heart rate. So let's go to the top of this and think about what the initial stimulus is to increase cardiac output. You can increase exercise by increasing your sympathetic nervous system activity. That happens when you get up and start moving around in your day in the morning. It happens when you start walking around or going to the gym and doing your exercises. The skeletal muscle pumps and the respiratory pumps help to increase the venous return to the heart. One thing that we haven't talked about in lecture yet is how there are skeletal muscles around all of your veins, and they help move blood back towards the heart. You also have breathing that helps reduce the pressure in the lungs, in the thorax, and that allows blood to flow back to the heart. So those are 2 important concepts that you can read about in your notes and that you can also read about in your book, and there are questions about it in your lab exercise. So you'll be learning about these concepts in a number of ways. But all of this exercise returns blood back to the heart, and that's known as venous return. That increases the end diastolic volume. That's the preload. That's the blood that is flowing back into the heart. And that on the graph a few slides ago, that is where you have the volume line increasing in the chart, in the middle of the chart, filling the ventricles. You can increase ventricular time due to having a slower heart rate. This is really important for trained athletes, people who exercise regularly. Your heart is more efficient, and there's time between the heartbeats for your filling the heart with blood. And that's phase 3 of the cardiac cycle and the beginning of phase 1 of the cardiac cycle. If you increase ventricular filling because the heart is beating at a modest rate, you have increased venous return, increased end diastolic volume, increased stroke volume, and an increase in the cardiac output. So I'm just following this progression of things to the bottom of the chart. We learned about these hormones in the first chapter of this semester. Epinephrine, where does that come from? It comes from the adrenal medulla. Thyroxine, that comes from the thyroid gland in the mediastinum. And then you have excess calcium. All of these things can increase the contractility of the heart and decrease the end systolic volume. These things that increase the contractility of the heart means that the heart pumps harder with each beat and empties more. When it empties more, that means the end systolic volume goes down. If you need to look back to the previous slides to see where the end systolic volume is, that might be a good thing to do. But the combination of decreasing the end systolic volume and increasing the end diastolic volume will increase the stroke volume and increase cardiac output. If we look at the right-hand side of this chart, the nervous system responds to exercise, fright, anxiety, or a decrease in blood pressure. It wants to bring the blood pressure up to meet the metabolic needs of the body. That's normal and good. You will get an increase in the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, we saw the neurons of the sympathetic nervous system. What color were they? I think they were green on that slide a while back in this lecture. And the sympathetic nerves increase the contractility. Remember, it innervates the SA node, the AV node, and the left ventricle. It increases the heart rate here. It increases the contractility here. So it's affecting the heart rate and the stroke volume when your sympathetic nervous system is activated. If your parasympathetic nervous system is activated because you are at rest, that will decrease the heart rate, but that's not shown here. This is all about what's happening if you're increasing your heart rate for some reason. It's good to understand this chart when you're increasing the cardiac output, but you should also, as an exercise on your own, you should draw this chart on a blank piece of paper with all of the arrows reversed and understand things that will decrease cardiac output. If you stop your exercise, if your heart's not beating as fast, if you're not having these hormones going through your body, if you don't have that fight or flight response activated, instead you have the sympathetic nervous system activated, then you're going to have a decrease in cardiac output. You want that to happen when you are at rest, when you are sleeping, when you're enjoying something fun in your life. You want your cardiac output to go down when you are in a resting mode. All right, so that's something you can do on your own time. In your notes, you have detailed information about how to calculate a cardiac output. That's after the phases of the cardiac cycle. You will need to do that calculation when you get to your next test, so please review that, and we can go over that in lab or lecture before your next exam. Recording sound, recording sound.